Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another George Talk. I'm delighted to introduce you to Ron Bateman, who's one of the founder trustees committee. We weren't a charity at that point of the society. Ron did several jobs at once when we first got going, including secretary and including editing the journal before handing on to Masha. He has written several very interesting books, and his latest one is very relevant to our area of interest because it's wartime BBC and propaganda. Over to you, Ron.
Can you see me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, welcome to Italy, everyone. We're quite rural here in sunny Umbria. The internet signal does occasionally play up, but hopefully not today. So it's probably best to crack on with our talk, Orwell, the BBC and the radio war, while the going is good. Now, it's surprising how often Orwell's name crops up when discussing wartime radio propaganda, especially as I haven't found any evidence of him having ever owned a radio set during wartime. As far as Orwell and the BBC Home Service is concerned, he and his wife Eileen were in the regular habit of popping across the road to the local pub to listen to the BBC's 6 o'clock news bulletin. Now, what this means is that many areas covered by this book, for example, the propaganda value of variety, he had no import. You know, legendary wartime entertainers such as Tommy Hanley, Vera Lynn, and the like, they get no mention in his diaries, which is a shame, really, in the case of the former, because we know he really enjoyed comedy. And he actually once took his young nephew to the cinema to watch a Charlie Chaplin film. So why does his name regularly feature? Well, not only was he an architect of propaganda for the BBC's Eastern Service, as we all know, he also recorded the content. He also recorded his observations on the content of the BBC's wartime news bulletins and how Londoners reacted to the broadcasts in his diaries. Now, in the limited time we have, I will, of course, emphasize Orwell's contribution in these areas, but I want to begin by focusing on some important background information, including aspects of the BBC's radio propaganda that doesn't feature significantly in other BBC histories. Now, the study of BBC radio propaganda throws up two key questions. How did the corporation adapt to the demands of wartime broadcasting? And how effective was the BBC in getting to grips with the new art of delivering radio propaganda overseas? The second question is particularly important, as over the course of the war, the corporation went from being a predominantly home organization to a predominantly overseas organization. And this in itself is actually quite amazing, because at first the British government failed to recognize the propaganda potential of radio and remained skeptical despite this new medium being able to reach large numbers of people simultaneously, both at home and across international borders, virtually uncontrolled. And importantly, it was a medium that could much more effectively appeal to the emotions of the listener. Now, even when the realization set in that propaganda was a necessary evil in warfare, it was still a deeply disparaged concept, meaning lies, exaggeration, thought manipulation, things that were considered to be the stuff of totalitarian regimes and not something that British broadcasting should seek to emulate. Now, in contrast, the dictatorships, particularly Hitler and Stalin, recognized the propaganda potential of radio and made massive use of it in influences both home audiences and populations abroad, where they established foreign language programs aimed at showcasing the supremacy of their ideologies. So let's just put up a picture of Dr. Goebbels here. Yeah, there we have him. Now, because the dictatorships utilized radio as a tool for the exclusive use of a single political party, Goebbels was insistent that a people's radio should be made available that all Germans could afford. Now here we see Goebbels demonstrating the limitations of the set at a radio exhibition in Berlin in 1938. I say limitations because whereas British radios were promoted as being able to receive broadcasts from all over the world, Goebbels' People set were purposely manufactured with only German and Austrian stations appearing on the dial. Now, because of this aversion to propaganda, Britain lagged behind her potential enemy significantly on the eve of war. Germany was broadcast in 36 foreign language programs compared with Britain's 10. Now, propaganda activities themselves are typically split into white, undisguised propaganda where no attempt is made to deceive, and black, deceptive or covert propaganda. And because the BBC stuck rigidly to its principles of honesty and accuracy, it rarely strayed into dark territory. Its golden rule was to tell the truth, good or bad. And this didn't always work in practice, as we shall discover. Now, World War II differed to previous wars in the sense that there was a degree of forward planning for total war. And this involved utilizing public broadcasting as an efficient means of disseminating vital information. The BBC assisted the government with broadcasts encouraging people to become volunteers rather than bystanders. You know, it's particularly successful in helping to recruit for the ARP and the Women's Voluntary Service. And it helped the public to interpret information leaflets distributed to millions of homes by the Home Office. Now, it's interesting in Orwell's wartime diaries that he records the exact dates when all of these leaflets came through the door. And the BBC's job was not only to help people understand the information contained in the leaflets, it also tried to give people an idea of what it was like being in a modern air raid. You know, one program, John Langdon Davis read extracts from the municipal log in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, where 3 days of air raids had resulted in over 30,000 casualties. I mean, the program probably scared a large number of people half to death, but it reached its target. Now, when the war actually began, the BBC's main job was the maintenance of morale. Morale was a word that haunted politicians. It sought to achieve this by careful dissemination of news and through providing high quality entertainment. Now, the number of news broadcasts increased dramatically in wartime. Delivering news was basically still a new art. Announcers had to lead the listener through the events in question. On both sides of the conflict, there was a realization that news had huge propaganda value. Now, in the interest of maintaining morale, the Ministry of Information needed the BBC to help the public bear the strain of war and effectively use the corporation as a filter between the grim realities of war and the anxious listener. Now, in the heat of conflict, the government shielded the public from bad news by censoring the BBC, by providing false information, by obstructing reporters, and by encouraging the softening up of certain news items. Now, this course of action might have occasionally been good for home front morale, but it more often handed the propaganda initiative to the enemy. Examples are Norway, where news of the Allied defeat and the British forces were pulling out was withheld. And the Luftwaffe raid on Scapa Flow is another example where the Admiralty sat on its account for over 6 hours, allowing the Germans to reap a major propaganda advantage with their heavily exaggerated report. Dunkirk is probably the most famous example where the willing cooperation of the BBC, the government and the armed forces successfully made a military disaster seem like a triumph. It was a strategy that sometimes worked. The MOI reported that morale stiffened as a result of the heroics of the little ships that rescued the soldiers from Dunkirk. Now, by the time of the fall of France, news was still being suppressed, and Orwell knew what was going on. In his diary entry, he writes, "In the middle of a fearful battle in which I suppose thousands of men are being killed every day, one has the impression that there is no news. As to the truthfulness of news, however, there is probably more suppression of news than downright lying. Now, Orwell also noted that not everybody listened to the news at times of great peril. On the evening of May 27th, 1940, at a time when the BEF were hemmed in at Dunkirk and Britain could have potentially been invaded at any moment, Orwell went with wife Eileen to the local pub to hear the evening news. The barmaid had no intention of turning the radio on, and when she finally relented, he observed that nobody else in the room bothered to listen. On another occasion, she told him, "We don't turn on the radio because the punters don't want the piano playing to be interrupted." Orwell commented that you have all the time the sensation that you are kicking against an impenetrable wall of stupidity. And then another diary entry, a few days later, he talks about drifting among the usual Sunday crowds in the city of London and reported that he saw no indication in any face or in anything that he could overhear that the people grasped that they were likely to be invaded. Now, following the fall of France, the threat of invasion was a time of great fear, and the cabinet was split over what action the public should take. Some wanted to do everything to make life difficult for the invader, while others wanted the public to stay put, as the military response had been impeded by roads being clogged with fleeing inhabitants in previously invaded cities of Europe. Now, the resulting "If the Invader Comes" initiative bore the hallmarks of compromise. This very fragile leaflet belonged to my grandfather, but it fell through the door of 14 million homes throughout Britain. And it was supported by a number of BBC radio programmes that were not well received. A listener research survey people thought they were out of touch with common sense and treated the public like blithering idiots. But before we move on to just say a little bit about the overseas service, it's worth just saying a little bit about this man, if I can bring him up. William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw. Now, although Orwell doesn't really allude to his broadcasts, they were hugely popular, and it wasn't necessarily the material. People found his accent and personality irresistible. Now, Orwell really only refers to Lord Haw Haw in the sense that he refers to his previous association with the British Union of Fascists. And Oswald Mosley and George didn't really get on. In fact, they despised each other. But one interesting thing, if you look at his diary entries during his time at the BBC, you can see that they had their own version of Haw Haw. He refers to the fact he listened to Lord Haw Haw today, but not William Joyce. So it would be interesting to find out who the other person was who he referred to as Lord Haw Haw. Now, the BBC were desperate to find an antidote to Haw Haw. Incoming Prime Minister Churchill's speeches were a huge boost. Haw Haw had met his match. They were probably the best propaganda the BBC ever broadcast. But the Ministry of Information insisted that the BBC needed something more. And thereafter began a series of Sunday night postscripts intended to lure listeners away from channel hopping onto the foreign stations. Now, after one or two uninspiring choices of speaker for the Sunday night postscript, they handed the microphone to this man, J.B. Priestley. In Bradford-born playwright Priestley, the BBC found their man. He very soon had over 14 million listeners, and the BBC's postbag in praise of his broadcast was bulging. But there was a problem. Priestley recognised that the working man wanted something more than victory from risking his life. His broadcast contained more than just a hint of socialist thinking, which brought the impartiality of the BBC into disrepute. And it angered Churchill by promoting views that were contrary to his own. Now, when the MOI had him removed, Orwell comments in his diary that Priestley, whose Sunday night postscripts were by implication socialist propaganda, had been shoved off the air, evidently at the insistence of the Communist Party. Now, Priestley's 14 million listeners were probably still smarting about his removal the next time they visited the ballot box. But I have to say, it's worth getting hold of a copy of his postscripts if you can. It's marvelous stuff. I managed to get hold of an American copy here, but there are more modern copies available now. The estate allowed me to reproduce a lot of good material, including the final passage from his Epic of Dunkirk. Now, just a little bit about the overseas service before we move on to talking about Orwell in India. The BBC effectively became the fourth arm of warfare, as it facilitated efforts to win heart and minds in war-affected areas and in other potentially vulnerable regions of the world. Now, remember I said earlier that 10 languages were being broadcast in September 1939. Well, by 1943, 48 languages were being broadcast, and there was never a time when the BBC transmitters fell silent. With a combined total of 133 hours of broadcasting a day, it sought to raise the morale of people living under occupation by countering enemy lies with truthfulness, and it broadcast material intended to destabilize the enemy. It also provided skilled personnel to black stations dedicated towards inflicting a program of psychological warfare on the enemy, subjects and soldiers alike, and also aided in the creation of resistance groups that evolved and emerged from the shadows inside the conquered nations and provided operational assistance to these groups thereafter. Now, directing radio propaganda overseas was a new and untried concept. The assumption was that top-line journalists would be best suited to the role. Noel Newsom at the Daily Telegraph was recruited into the role of European news editor 2 days before war was declared. If I just pop his picture up there now. Now, there was no propaganda policy during the early years of phony war. Newsom basically directed propaganda on his own initiative until Churchill's appointment as Prime Minister, when he was asked to broadcast his speeches in all languages, which wasn't something he needed to be told, really. But Churchill's speeches were typically edited to sound defeatist by the Germans. Now, on day one, when Newsom took over, the number of staff at his disposal, including editors, sub-editors, translators, announcers, it amounted to around 30 men. And within a few months, this grew to around 200. And then within 2 years, it amounted to around 500 men and women. And it was Noel Newsom who would set out the BBC's strategy for news as a weapon of war and direct a huge broadcasting operation mounted in 25 different languages for a total of over 23 hours a day. Now, in the absence of any forward planning, the BBC's overseas radio propaganda effort relied almost exclusively on improvisation, and yet the corporation very effectively established itself as the voice of Britain. As more countries fell under Nazi rule, Newsom's biggest worry was the risks associated with directing inflammatory propaganda to those who could not be helped militarily. You know, for a listener in Nazi-controlled Europe, to be discovered tuning into the BBC's European service could mean a death sentence. Now, Orwell picked up on this when he reviewed this marvelous little book here, Voices in the Darkness, by a guy called Edward Tanya Lean. He's actually the brother of David Lean, the filmmaker. And I think he was actually director of external broadcasting in the European service. Now, in his review, Orwell writes that the BBC's European service propagandists were operating on a very easy wicket because the penalties for listening in occupied Europe were so harsh, it ensured that the broadcast would be accepted as true. And this led Orwell to the conclusion that radio had the unexpected effect of making war seem a much more truthful business. Now, Orwell also believed that radio propaganda tended to speed up processes that were already in operation rather than achieve anything significant on its own. And I tend to agree with him here because I think this was especially true of Italy, where so successful was the anti-Mussolini propaganda that when the Allies landed in Sicily, they were welcomed as liberators rather than invaders in a lot of cases. Now, in many occupied countries, so effective was the BBC's radio propaganda that the Nazis were compelled to confiscate all known radio receiving equipment, even if it meant abandoning their own propaganda strategy. And another key point is that it was impossible for the BBC to speak with one voice, as listeners could comprise German factory workers, French or other European citizens living under occupation, or even native people in the dominions of the empire, as we shall see. Now, added to this, the corporation came under increasing pressure to allow the London-based exiled governments of conquered nations free time on its transmitters, an important concession that has been largely ignored in previous BBC histories beyond the cursory mention. Now, discussing the various services goes well beyond the scope of a 40-minute talk, as does the continual problems and interdepartmental squabbling that hampered the service in its early years. But believe me, it's all in here. Now, two significant appointments that were actioned that I think are well worth mentioning. Here we are. Mr. Yvonne Kirkpatrick, a Foreign Office man, he was brought in by the BBC as a special advisor on foreign affairs. Kirkpatrick came with a reputation of being a real terrier, somebody who was going to tear the pants off the BBC. Now, for the German service propagandists, he was a very useful man to have around. He had had a seat at the table during the Munich negotiations. He saw in Hitler the contempt he felt, not only towards Britain, but the British Prime Minister. And so effective was Kirkpatrick in addressing all the early difficulties, he eventually became BBC European Service Controller and actioned the split from the overseas service. Now, another huge boost was the replacement of Duff Cooper at the Ministry of Information with this man. On the right of Churchill here, Mr. Brendan Bracken. Now, Duff Cooper had never been comfortable in his role at the MOI, and he also had very little interest in propaganda, which I think Kirkpatrick picked up on. Now, Bracken, who was a protege of Churchill, was brought in to shake up the BBC. And unlike his master, who despised the corporation, Bracken actually became a real champion of the BBC, and he turned up the heat on anyone who dared to criticise it. He actioned the creation of the Political Warfare Executive, which aimed at greater coordination of propaganda in line with propaganda policy. And Kirkpatrick described him as a tower of strength to have around. Now, moving on to India then, it's worth giving some background. How was it that Orwell came to be working for the Eastern Service of the BBC? Now, at the beginning of the war, the government was faced with the challenge of getting India on side at a particularly delicate point in the relationship between ruler and ruled. Subject populations needed to be convinced that they would be far worse off under Hitler, despite Gandhi having accused War Cabinet emissary Stafford Cripps of attempting to bribe India with a post-dated check on a failing bank. Now, government ministers were particularly alarmed that the BBC was unconcerned with transmitting news to India and criticised the corporation's indifference towards the listening public in Britain's most treasured imperial possession. The BBC's India service finally resumed broadcasting again in May 1940, typically focusing on British culture and music, along with occasional news bulletins. I have to say that I think, from what I've read, the reception to the service was lukewarm. And one incident is particularly interesting. In July 1941, the journalist Kingsley Martin launched a bitter attack on the solemnity of the BBC's India service in the New Statesman, citing its failure to appreciate that Indians despised European dance music. Plenty of Indians would welcome serious talks on literature and other topics which recognise their equality of interests. Now, there's a certain irony here that it was the savage criticism of the service by Martin that could possibly have led to Orwell being recruited by the BBC. Orwell had long since held a personal grudge against Martin, since he had rejected his review of Borcanau's The Spanish Cockpit on political grounds. He had described Martin as a bloody fool who seems to think war is a cricket match. Now, the business of formulating propaganda to India presented a different and more challenging undertaking when compared to other forms of political warfare. For unlike in enemy-occupied territories where the intention was to spread disaffection and to motivate and provide guidance for resistance groups. Or the aim of the propagandists working for the India service was to appeal to subjugated peoples to side with their oppressors over the common enemy. Now, this was a difficult task given the delicacy of wartime relations between Britain and India, particularly at a time when the independence movement was in the ascendancy. The corporation had to reflect the views of the National Congress Party, even though many of its anti-British leaders, including those of the Quit India movement, had been slung in jail. Now, there's a good quote here from another former employee of the Eastern Service who remembered that nobody pretended that broadcasts from London could dissipate the fog of India's political troubles, but it could project a beam of light into the gloom and consolidate common misunderstandings. Now, the chances of successfully disseminating radio propaganda to India was also hampered by the fact that barely 1 in every 4,000 Indians possessed a radio, and the department laboured away, unsure of whether they were having any real impact on the Indian intelligentsia. When Orwell applied to the BBC in August 1941, his selection for a job organising propaganda was unlikely, his deep anti-imperialism having been the hallmark of his first published novel, Burmese Days. Now, his BBC security check is interesting. It states that he came under notice of the police in February 1936 in connection with his communist activities in Wigan. And it also mentions that he works at a bookshop for a guy called Westrope, who holds socialist views and considers himself an intellectual. And I've actually got a copy of the result of his BBC security check, if I can just bring it up here. It's quite interesting, actually. You know, regardless of Orwell's questionable past, his clearance report states nothing recorded against, and he was accepted onto the staff of the corporation. He had likely captivated his new employers with his particular interest in the Far East and his experience of being among the Burmese people. But one thing particularly interests me on this, if you look towards the bottom, it talks about his previous employment with the Indian Imperial Police. It says lately worked for the Ministry of Information. Now, we know that Eileen, his wife, worked for the censorship department at the MOI, but I'm not really sure that Orwell ever actually worked for the ministry himself. I mean, I don't have my library to hand, so I can't double and treble check this, but I'm not sure that he ever worked for the Ministry of Information, so somebody else might hopefully have a little bit of input on that. So moving on. Throughout a period of well over 2 years, Orwell worked firstly as talks assistant and later as talks producer for the section. This would include editing over 200 newsletters for broadcast to India, Malaysia, and Indonesia in English and translated into many other languages. His salary of £640 a year was the best he had earned since leaving Burma, and it's unlikely that the irony would not have been lost on Orwell, that he was only really paid well when working indirectly or directly for the Raj. Now, Orwell's other responsibilities included a number of cultural, educational, and political programs on general issues, including propaganda. He also expanded the range of distance learning courses and supplemented them by arranging talks involving many distinguished speakers from the worlds of literature and science. There's a superb account, if you can get hold of a copy, in Peter Davison's Literary Lives. I don't have my copy here, but it's an excellent account of Orwell's work in India. Now, the suggestion has been made, I think in particular in Stourton's book, Auntie's War, that Orwell's propaganda work placed him in very difficult territory, and in Stourton's words, leads him into a betrayal of everything he stood for. Now, Orwell was acutely aware of such whisperings. After all, much of the Axis propaganda and the BBC's counter-propaganda involved ignoring passages in Nehru's speeches. In his wartime diary in April 1942, Orwell refers to the betrayals and contradictions that working for the BBC had forced upon him, and concluded that sooner or later we all write our own epitaphs. He even acknowledged that he was rapidly becoming propaganda-minded and developed a cunning, developing a cunning he did not previously have. Now, even though he was a committed anti-imperialist, Orwell was at pains to inform the subject peoples not to believe in the assurances of liberty for the conquered peoples being churned out by the Nazi propaganda machine, including high-sounding promises of freedom being directed towards natives currently under British rule. In his 1941 essay, All Propaganda is Lies, Orwell emphasized that point, that all the while German wireless woos its Italian listeners with promises of independence, it woos the British public by declaring that Germany has no wish to break up the British Empire and praises the British for the civilizing work they have done in India. Now, this was typical of the tone Orwell adopted in his efforts to keep Indian subjects on side. You know, before people should start criticizing him of betraying his ideals, his intention was to present an awareness of what a fascist victory would mean to the chances of India's independence. And he kept his corner clean by refraining from the added colour and distortion of the type of propaganda he despised. And I think this is an important point. I think to suggest that Orwell's propaganda was a betrayal of his values is to ignore the distinction between honest and dishonest propaganda. In a book he edited in 1943, Talking to India, he was more than happy to allow examples of his own BBC broadcasts to stand alongside those of the Axis. He felt that those who criticised him should actually find out what he was doing at the BBC before accusing his good faith. Now, when someone at the corporation suggested he should broadcast as George Orwell rather than Eric Blair, effectively putting his literary reputation on the line, he was able to extract considerable license from the BBC to conduct the programmes on his own terms. Not only did this give him a much greater freedom of speech, it also afforded him greater political license when he has insisted that his commentaries followed what is by implication a left line. Now, this suggests that during his time at the BBC, Orwell tended to follow his own propaganda agenda rather than the one that had been prescribed. He was also mixing with one or two suspect characters at the BBC, something that again brought him back onto the radar of the security service when he applied for clearance to Allied HQ in 1943. His security file again contains tales that gossiping BBC informants had reported about him. You know, it's worth just. He has a good many Indian friends and has offered employment to K.S. Shelvanka. And he's also telling some of his friends that his department was trying to get Mulraj Anand onto the staff. Now, Shelvanka's book had been banned, while Anand was a socialist writer and propagandist who had been active in the Indian independence movement, and his employers were dead against bringing him on board. But if we look at the team that Orwell surrounded himself with when he was talks producer at the Indian service, we see there to the right of him, there's Mulraj Anand. He managed to get his friends on board. Now, Orwell was also described by colleagues as being a bit of an anarchist, a man of advanced communist views, and a man in touch with extremist elements who had thrown his lot in with Victor Germans, the left-wing publisher. He was also described as distressing in a bohemian fashion. And this picture particularly amuses me, you know, when I think back to, I think it's Stephen Wadham's book about his tapes, his interviews with people who knew Orwell, and the a couple of them comment that Orwell really didn't care too much about his personal appearance, and talk about wearing shirts, 2 sizes collar, 2 sizes too big around the collar. You know, there's a little bit of evidence of this, I suppose, but I do like that photograph particularly. Okay, so moving on then. Even though Orwell worked diligently in his small and remote outpost in the radio war, he found the work both tedious and frustrating and felt that his efforts were a total waste of time. His resignation letter reflected his sense of frustration that broadcasting propaganda to India was a hopeless task, an assumption that is probably correct for a country that had one radio for every 4,000 people. Now, the service did expand significantly during his time with the corporation, with 12 Asiatic languages being incorporated within the 47 being broadcast. Orwell records in Talking to India that there were 5 million Indians literate in English, and several millions more could speak it, a figure which added up to only 3% of the population. He could only console himself with the fact that no attempt was ever made to boycott listening to the BBC in India. Now, finally, on the question of whether India, with her aspirations of freedom, had anything to fear from a Nazi victory, it is worth consulting the members of Yvonne Kirkpatrick, the former controller of the BBC's European service. And this is another excellent book, The Inner Circle, if you can get hold of a copy. I think it was written around about 59, I think. Excellent book. Now, he recalls an incident that occurred during his time as First Secretary of the British Embassy in Berlin, where he accompanied Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax and British Ambassador Neville Henderson during their respective interviews with the volatile and unpredictable Führer. Now, at the very mention of India, Hitler had been quick to air his views on British policy. He could not understand, he said, why we tolerated disorder or wasted time in parley with Congress. The remedy was quite simple. Shoot Gandhi, he said in his sharp staccato accent. And if that does not suffice to reduce them to submission, shoot a dozen members of Congress. And if that does not suffice, shoot 200 and so on until order is established. You will see how quickly they will collapse as soon as you make it clear that you mean business. Now, as Hitler continued this tirade, a clear indication that he intended to massacre countless hundreds of India's National Congress until they cowered to his will, Kirkpatrick looked across at the Foreign Secretary and studied his expression. Halifax gazed at Hitler with a mixture of astonishment, repugnance, and compassion. The feeling that it would have been a complete waste of time to argue had long taken hold. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the talk for this evening. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much indeed, Ron. That was very, very interesting.